What would you do if a complete stranger left you a crumbling bookstore, only for you to discover it held a secret worth millions? For one struggling woman, a random inheritance became a deadly game of deceit, buried family lies, and a single letter that flipped her reality upside down. The Seattle rain lashed against the cracked window of Beatrice Gallagher's cramped apartment, mirroring the bleak reality of her life. At 28, Beatrice was drowning. Her mother's prolonged illness had drained her savings, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt and an echoing grief that refused to fade. Now, clutching a bright pink eviction notice in her trembling hands, she had exactly 14 days to figure out how to survive. Then came the sharp knock at the door. It was a courier, drenched and impatient, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. The return address read, Wright and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Ashwood, Maine. Beatrice frowned. She knew no one in Maine. Her family, what little she had of it, was rooted entirely in the Pacific Northwest. Tearing the thick paper open, she pulled out a formal legal document. Her eyes scanned the dense, bureaucratic jargon until they stopped dead on a single, impossible sentence. Hereby bequeath the entirety of the property, known as the Labyrinth Pages, located at 421 Willow Street, Ashwood, Maine, to Miss Beatrice Gallagher, in accordance with the final wishes of Mr. Arthur Pendleton. Beatrice read the name aloud. Arthur Pendleton. It tasted foreign on her tongue. She had never heard her mother mention an Arthur. She had never heard anyone mention an Arthur. Yet according to the documents, this complete stranger had just left her a commercial property and the apartment situated directly above it. There was no catch, no hidden fees mentioned in the letter, only a plane ticket, already paid for, and a set of brass keys that felt heavier than they looked. 48 hours later, Beatrice found herself standing on the cracked, uneven pavement of Willow Street, in the sleepy, fog-drenched coastal town of Ashwood. The town looked like it had been trapped in amber since the late 1980s. Faded storefronts lined the quiet streets, and the salt-heavy air clung to everything. But nothing looked more forgotten than the building standing before her. The Labyrinth Pages was a towering, 3-story Victorian structure that leaned slightly to the left, as if exhausted by the weight of its own history. The dark green paint was peeling like sunburnt skin, and the large bay windows were thick with a decade of grime. Above the door, a wooden sign creaked in the ocean breeze, the gold leaf letters barely legible. Taking a deep breath, Beatrice pushed the heavy oak door open. A small brass bell chimed a weak, pathetic note. The interior was a bibliophile's graveyard. Towering bookshelves, warped by moisture and time, created a literal maze of narrow aisles. The smell of decaying paper, damp wood, and old dust was overpowering. There were thousands of books, stacked haphazardly on tables, shoved into corners, and overflowing onto the floorboards. It was chaotic, beautiful, and utterly overwhelming. Miss Gallagher, I presume? Beatrice jumped, her hand flying to her chest. Stepping out from the shadows of the history section was a man in a rumpled grey suit. He was balding, sweating profusely, despite the chill in the room, and clutching a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. I'm Thomas Wright, he said, extending a clammy hand. The attorney who sent the letter. I was a friend of Arthur's. Well, as much of a friend as Arthur allowed anyone to be. Mr. Wright, Beatrice said, shaking his hand hesitantly. I don't understand any of this. I don't know an Arthur Pendleton. My mother never mentioned him. There has to be some kind of mistake. Thomas Wright wiped his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief. He looked nervously toward the front door, his eyes darting at the shadows outside. There is no mistake, Miss Gallagher. Arthur was very specific. He drafted this will 3 months ago, shortly before the lung cancer took his voice. He knew exactly who you were, and he was adamant that you, and only you, receive this building. Before Beatrice could press him for answers, the front door violently swung open, shattering the quiet atmosphere. The brass bell tore off its hinge and clattered to the floor. A tall man in a tailored, ridiculously expensive charcoal suit stormed into the shop. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark and furious. He looked entirely out of place in the dusty, forgotten bookstore. "So you actually showed up," the man spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Richard," Thomas Wright squeaked, taking a distinct step backward. "You shouldn't be here. The reading of the will is concluded." Richard Montgomery ignored the lawyer completely, closing the distance between himself and Beatrice. He was Arthur Pendleton's estranged nephew, though Beatrice wouldn't know that until Thomas hastily whispered it to her. Richard looked Beatrice up and down with undisguised disgust. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low octave. "My uncle was a delusional, paranoid old fool in his final days. The state of his mind was thoroughly compromised. This building belongs to the Montgomery family. It has belonged to us for generations. I don't know what kind of con you ran on an old, dying man from across the country, but you are not keeping this property." Beatrice stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I didn't run a con. I didn't even know he existed until 2 days ago." Richard laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Spare me the innocent act. I'm a developer. I don't care about these rotting books. I care about the land. I will give you $50,000 right now to sign the deed over to me and get back on whatever budget airline you flew in on. $50,000. To Beatrice, it was a life-changing amount. It would clear her debts. It would give her a fresh start. But as she looked at Richard's desperate, hungry eyes, a sudden realization washed over her. He was offering too much for a rotting building in a dead town. He was too desperate. "No," Beatrice said, her voice surprisingly steady. Richard's face hardened. "Excuse me?" "I said no," Beatrice repeated, lifting her chin. "The bookstore is mine, and it isn't for sale." Richard stared at her for a long, terrifying moment. Then he leaned in close, his cologne suffocatingly sharp. "You are making a very grave mistake, Beatrice. You have no idea what you're standing on. You have no idea what this town is capable of hiding." Without another word, he turned and marched out of the store, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him. Beatrice was left standing in the dust, the heavy brass keys burning a hole in her pocket. Realizing she had just walked into the middle of a war, she didn't understand. The apartment above the labyrinth. Pages was as bleak as the store beneath it. Faded floral wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the ancient radiator hissed and clanked like a dying animal. Beatrice spent her first night wrapped in a moth-eaten quilt on a sagging mattress, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The wind howled off the Maine coast, rattling the single-pane windows, but it wasn't the weather that kept her awake. It was Richard Montgomery's parting threat. "You have no idea what you're standing on." Around 2 in the morning, the noise started. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound echoing through the floorboards from the bookstore below. Thump, creak, snap. Beatrice froze, the breath catching in her throat. Someone was downstairs. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood, and grabbed the only weapon she could find, a heavy iron fire poker, resting by the unused hearth. Creeping down the narrow, darkened staircase that connected the apartment to the back office of the shop, she held her breath. Through the crack in the office door, Beatrice peered into the main shop. A single flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust. A figure dressed entirely in black was moving frantically through the history section. They weren't stealing the antique cash register, nor were they stuffing rare books into a bag. Instead, the intruder was on their hands and knees, violently prying up the rotting floorboards with a crowbar. What are they looking for? Beatrice thought, panic gripping her chest. Suddenly, her foot shifted, and a floorboard beneath her gave a sharp, echoing whine. The flashlight instantly snapped off. The bookstore was plunged into absolute pitch blackness. Beatrice stood completely still, her heart hammering loud enough to deafen her. She heard the heavy thud of boots running toward the back alley exit, the screech of rusted hinges, and the slam of the door. By the time the Ashwood police arrived the next morning, the sun was casting long, grey shadows through the shop. Officer Dempsey, a burly, apathetic man with a thick moustache and a coffee-stained uniform, walked through the torn-up history section with a bored expression. "Probably just a vagrant, Miss Gallagher," Dempsey mumbled, not even bothering to take notes. "Lots of junkies looking for a warm place to sleep. They get spooked easily. A vagrant doesn't bring a crowbar to pry up solid oak floorboards, officer," Beatrice snapped, her patience wearing thin. "They were looking for something specific. Richard Montgomery threatened me yesterday. I want that on the record." Dempsey paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. The mention of the Montgomery name seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. "Mr. Montgomery is a respected businessman, Miss Gallagher. He practically keeps this town's economy afloat. I'd be careful throwing accusations like that around. My advice? Take whatever money he offered you and go back to Seattle. This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." After Dempsey left, Beatrice locked the front door, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and sheer terror. The police were useless. Perhaps they were even in Richard's pocket. If she was going to figure out why Arthur Pendleton left her this curse, she had to do it herself. She fetched a flashlight and a pair of heavy work gloves from the back office and returned to the history section. The intruder had managed to pry up 3 large planks before fleeing. Kneeling in the dirt and debris, Beatrice peered into the dark space between the floor joists. Nothing. Just old cobwebs and rat droppings. Frustrated, she sat back, her gaze wandering up the nearest bookshelf. The shelves here were built directly into the plaster of the wall. But as Beatrice looked closer, she noticed something odd. The bottom shelf, heavily laden with encyclopedias, was slightly uneven. The wood didn't sit flush against the brickwork behind it. Dropping the fire poker, she began to pull the heavy, dusty encyclopedias off the shelf, tossing them onto the floor. Once the shelf was clear, she pressed her hands against the back panel. It shifted. Beatrice's breath hitched. She pushed harder, sliding the wooden panel to the left. Behind it, nestled into a hollowed-out cavity in the original brick foundation, was a small, rusted iron lockbox. She pulled it out. It was remarkably heavy. The lock had long since rusted away, allowing her to pry the lid open with a loud crunch of oxidized metal. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the dampness, was a thick envelope. Her name was written on the front, in elegant, looping cursive. To Beatrice. Her hands trembling, she tore the envelope open and unfolded the crisp, yellowed stationery inside. "My dearest Beatrice, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and Richard has already tried to terrify you into selling. Do not trust my nephew. He is a parasite who knows only greed. He believes this property contains nothing but rotting paper, but he suspects there is something more. He is right, but he does not know the truth. You do not know me, but I knew you before you could even speak. I knew your mother, Abigail. We shared a life before the world forced us onto different paths. We also shared a secret that has haunted me for 32 years. The Labyrinth Pages is not just a bookstore. It is a vault. What lies beneath this town, what your mother and I buried decades ago, cannot fall into the hands of the Montgomery family. To find the truth about who you really are and what you are truly inheriting, you must look for The Count, the 1846 Paris edition. It holds the first. Be careful, Beatrice. There are eyes in Ashwood that never sleep. With profound regret, Arthur Pendleton. Beatrice dropped the letter as if it had caught fire. Her mother, her quiet, struggling, ordinary mother, had known this wealthy eccentric. They had buried a secret. The room spun. Her entire life felt like a carefully constructed lie. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Beatrice screamed, spinning around. Standing in the aisle, clutching a leather-bound journal to her chest, was a woman Beatrice had never seen before. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, bird-like features and piercing green eyes. "How did you get in here?" Beatrice demanded, snatching the fire poker off the floor. "The door is locked." "I have a spare key. Arthur gave it to me years ago," the woman said smoothly, completely unbothered by the weapon. "I'm Evelyn Reed. I'm the local historian, and based on the look of sheer terror on your face, Miss Gallagher, I'd say you just found Arthur's confession." Evelyn smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're going to need my help, Beatrice, because Richard isn't the only one looking for what your mother hid in this town." The heavy silence of the bookstore pressed against Beatrice's eardrums, shattered only by the steady, rhythmic drumming of Evelyn Reed's fingernails against the leather cover of her journal. The local historian stood completely motionless, her sharp green eyes dissecting every micro-expression on Beatrice's face. Beatrice slowly lowered the iron fire poker, though her grip remained white-knuckled around the cold metal. "How do you know about my mother?" Beatrice demanded, her voice betraying a tremor she fought desperately to suppress. Evelyn walked forward, her footsteps unnervingly silent on the dusty floorboards. Everyone who was anyone in Ashwood 30 years ago knew Abigail. She wasn't just a passing tourist. She was Arthur's archivist. She was brilliant, relentless, and she possessed an uncanny ability to find things that were intentionally buried. Together, they uncovered something the Montgomery family had spent 3 generations trying to keep hidden. "What did they find?" Beatrice asked, her mind racing. Evelyn offered a thin, cryptic smile. "That, my dear, is what we need to figure out. But I can tell you this. Richard Montgomery's grandfather was a ruthless industrialist. He practically built Ashwood, but he did it with dirty money and stolen assets. Arthur spent his life trying to expose the Montgomery Empire, and your mother helped him find the proof. But before they could go public, Abigail vanished. Arthur retreated into this bookstore, becoming a paranoid recluse. Until now." Evelyn gestured toward the chaotic mountains of literature surrounding them. "Arthur's letter mentioned a key hidden inside The Count. He meant The Count of Monte Cristo, specifically the 1846 serialized Paris edition. It's a notoriously rare printing. If Arthur kept it here, it's not sitting on a bargain shelf. We need to find it before Richard realizes his midnight break-in failed." Beatrice looked at the thousands of rotting, water-damaged spines. The task was monumental, bordering on impossible. But the desperation of her situation, the eviction notice, the empty bank account, the threatening presence of Richard, fueled a sudden, fierce determination. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a participant. "We start in the antiquarian section," Beatrice declared, grabbing her flashlight. For the next 4 hours, the two women worked in frantic, dust-choked silence. They systematically dismantled the oldest sections of the store, carefully peeling back layers of forgotten literature. The air grew thick and heavy, the smell of decaying paper clinging to their clothes. Beatrice's hands were stained black with ink and grime, her fingernails chipped from prying open jammed glass display cases. As the grandfather clock in the corner chimed noon, Beatrice found herself crawling beneath a heavy mahogany display table that had collapsed on one side. Tucked away in the darkest corner, partially concealed by a pile of useless modern encyclopedias, was a small, lead-lined lockbox. It was entirely unassuming, completely devoid of ornate markings. "Evelyn," Beatrice called out, her voice raspy, "I found something." The historian practically sprinted across the room, dropping a stack of poetry books in her haste. Beatrice dragged the heavy box into the light. It wasn't locked. With trembling hands, she popped the latches and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, was a breathtakingly beautiful book. The leather binding was cracked and weathered, but the gold leaf lettering on the spine was unmistakable. Le Comte de Monte Cristo. "The 1846 edition," Evelyn breathed, her eyes widening with a hunger that made Beatrice instantly uneasy. "Open it! Quickly!" Beatrice carefully lifted the fragile book. As she opened the front cover, the binding let out a dry crack. The pages were hollowed out. Inside the carved cavity lay 2 items, a heavy, intricately forged iron key, and a small, folded piece of parchment. Beatrice unfolded the parchment. It was a hand-drawn map of the bookstore's ground floor, but with a bizarre addition. An arrow pointed directly toward the massive brick fireplace in the back office. A fireplace Beatrice knew for a fact had been sealed off with mortar decades ago. Before Beatrice could process the map, the front windows of the bookstore rattled violently. A sleek, black luxury SUV had just hopped the curb, parking directly on the sidewalk outside the shop. Richard Montgomery stepped out, accompanied by 2 massive men in dark suits who looked less like security and more like mercenaries. "He's here," Beatrice whispered, panic seizing her chest. Evelyn's demeanor changed instantly. The helpful historian vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. In a flash of movement, Evelyn lunged forward, snatching the iron key from the hollowed-out book. "Hey!" Beatrice shouted, reaching for it. Evelyn shoved Beatrice hard against the mahogany table. "I'm sorry, Beatrice," Evelyn sneered, her voice dripping with malice. "But your mother ruined my life when she stole Arthur's affection. I've waited 30 years to claim what they hid. I'm not letting a naive little girl take it from me." Evelyn sprinted toward the back office, leaving Beatrice stunned and bruised. The front door of the bookstore exploded inward, the deadbolt shattering wood as Richard's men kicked it open. "Tear this place apart," Richard commanded, stepping into the dust-filled air. He spotted Beatrice scrambling to her feet. "Ah, Miss Gallagher, I see you're still stubbornly attached to my property. Let's have a chat." "You don't own this place," Beatrice spat, grabbing the heavy fire poker once again. Richard laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "I own the judge, the police, and the town council, which means I own this building. Now where is the key my uncle hid?" Beatrice glanced toward the back office. She knew she couldn't fight Richard and his men, but she also knew Evelyn was heading straight for the sealed fireplace with the only key. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it now. "I don't have it," Beatrice lied, her voice steady. "But I know who does. Evelyn Reed." Richard's face contorted with rage. "That miserable old vulture. Where did she go?" "Into the back," Beatrice said, backing away toward the history section. "She's looking for a way into the Foundation." Richard signaled his men. "Get her." As the two massive men barreled toward the back office, Beatrice didn't wait. She slipped into the maze of bookshelves, moving silently through the dark, familiar aisles, her mind racing to formulate a plan to outsmart them all. The labyrinth pages became a chaotic hunting ground. The sound of Richard's men tearing apart the back office echoed through the damp air, punctuated by Evelyn's frantic screams as they cornered her. Beatrice slipped silently through the shadows of the biography section, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed to reach the back office, but she needed a massive advantage. As she crept closer, she heard a violent crack. Peeking around the corner of a towering bookshelf, she witnessed one of Richard's men wielding a sledgehammer against the sealed brick fireplace. Evelyn was pinned against the wall by the other thug, her face bruised, the iron key clutched desperately in her hand. Richard stood in the center of the room, adjusting his cuffs with sickening calm. "Break it down," Richard ordered. "My grandfather swore Arthur hid the ledgers down there." Ledgers? Beatrice thought, her mind connecting the dots. The treasure wasn't gold. It was blackmail. It was the undeniable proof of the Montgomery family's crimes, the stolen assets, the corruption, the dirty money that built Ashwood. If Richard destroyed those ledgers, his family's legacy would remain untouched, and Arthur's life's work would be erased forever. The sledgehammer broke through the ancient mortar, sending a cascade of red dust onto the floor. Behind the fireplace wasn't a chimney flue, but a dark, descending stone staircase that vanished into the pitch-black belly of the earth. Richard nodded to his man, who wrenched Evelyn's arm backward. She shrieked, dropping the heavy iron key. Richard calmly picked it up. "Wait here," Richard told his men. "Keep her quiet. If the girl shows her face, break her legs." Richard clicked on a flashlight and descended into the dark staircase. Beatrice knew she had seconds. She looked at the heavy shelves surrounding her. Arthur had always complained about the structural integrity of the store. With a deep breath, Beatrice gripped the edge of the tallest, most overloaded oak bookshelf in the aisle, positioned directly beside the entrance to the back office. She planted her feet and shoved with every ounce of strength she possessed. The wood groaned loudly. The massive shelf tilted, and gravity took over. With a deafening crash that shook the entire building, the bookshelf toppled forward, slamming into the adjacent shelf like a domino. Thousands of heavy books rained down in a suffocating avalanche. The second shelf crashed directly across the doorway of the back office, completely trapping the two men and Evelyn under a mountain of heavy wood and literature. Beatrice didn't hesitate. Scrambling over the debris, she dove through the shattered fireplace and plunged into the dark, damp staircase. She descended rapidly, the air growing freezing cold and smelling intensely of salt and mildew. At the bottom lay a heavy, iron-reinforced wooden door, hanging wide open. Inside the cavernous smuggling tunnel, illuminated by Richard's flashlight, was an old, rusted bank vault door. Richard was frantically trying to fit the iron key into the complex locking mechanism. "It's over, Richard," Beatrice said, stepping into the light, the heavy fire poker raised. Richard spun around, panicking. "How did you get down here?" "Your men are trapped," Beatrice said, her voice echoing. "The state troopers will be here soon. I called them before I knocked the shelves down." It was a bluff, but Richard didn't know that. "You think I care about the police?" Richard snarled, abandoning the vault and drawing a sleek silver handgun. "My family owns this state, but you are a loose end, just like your mother." Beatrice froze, staring down the barrel of the gun. "That's right," Richard sneered, taking a step closer. Arthur thought he was so clever, hiding Abigail away. But my father found her. He made sure she kept her mouth shut. The stress of it, the constant running. It's what made her sick, Beatrice. We didn't kill her, but we certainly put her in the grave. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over Beatrice. Her mother's lifelong anxiety, her refusal to settle, it was all because of the man standing in front of her. "You're a monster," Beatrice whispered. "I'm a survivor," Richard replied, raising the gun. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed through the cavern as a rusted pipe shifted in the damp draught. Richard flinched, instinctively looking over his shoulder. It was the distraction Beatrice needed. She swung the heavy iron fire poker with all her might, striking Richard squarely across the wrist. The gun discharged wildly, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space, before clattering across the stone floor. Richard howled in pain, dropping to his knees. Beatrice kicked the gun into the dark water of a nearby drainage grate. She stood over him, breathing heavily. "You don't own me," Beatrice said, "and you don't own Ashwood anymore." Minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning. Beatrice's bluff hadn't been entirely false. The massive crash of the bookshelves had prompted a neighbor to call the state authorities, bypassing the corrupt local police entirely. When the troopers forced the vault open, they found ledgers detailing the Montgomery family's century of extortion, alongside a collection of priceless, stolen historical artifacts. Richard and his men were arrested, and the Montgomery Empire dissolved overnight. 6 months later, the Seattle rain was a distant memory. Beatrice Gallagher stood behind the newly polished mahogany counter of the labyrinth pages. The reward money from recovering the stolen artifacts had made Beatrice a millionaire. But she hadn't sold the building. She kept it. As the brass bell above the door chimed, Beatrice smiled. She had lost her mother to the secrets of this town, but in the ashes of those secrets, she had found exactly where she was meant to belong. Are you left breathless by that ending? If Beatrice's epic showdown and the dark truth behind the Montgomery Empire kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this video to support the channel. Do you think Beatrice made the right choice keeping the bookstore?